Now I can hear you. How are you doing?
Good.
Yeah?
Happy Constitution Day.
Yeah, I would use another word. Not happy. The unhappy Constitution Day. So get off your high horse and get on the bus, 'cause he may, but you're not even one of us. Did they already do the install? Do you know, Jean?
I don't know.
It would be good to see that.
Yeah.
Kelly,
Okay, we're going to go ahead and start with Jean and let her read the poem. So I'll mute Kat and the musician, I guess, for now. Those were my instructions. So here we go.
Hi, I'm Jean Sweeney, and I wrote this to the men in power. Dear men in power, why are you so afraid of all Americans being citizens of equal stature? Why aren't you asking, how can I help strengthen democracy, instead of trying to shoot arrows through its heart? Dear men in power, do you think it is acceptable to trivialize 100 years of work by people who want a democracy where the government can no longer discriminate against half the population? For 233 years, amending the Constitution has been messy. Most amendments have legal issues. The system functions so that when the people have spoken, with the final state ratifying a constitutional amendment, an updated constitution is immediately published. On January 27th of 2020, when Virginia ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, saying the government can no longer discriminate based on sex, it was added to the Constitution, and publication of an updated Constitution is required by law, the Constitution, the President's oath of office, the will of the people, and 233 years of precedent. Our country has the right to have the ERA published and then have the legal issues around it be properly brought before the courts. The 27th Amendment was ratified and published 203 years after it was proposed by Congress in 1789. It is an executive branch abuse of power to block publication of an updated Constitution with the ERA as the 28th Amendment. The fact that the last administration maneuvered the blocking of publication is no excuse for this administration to continue the blockade. In the 1970s, the senator who demanded that a timeline on equality for half the population was a racist and a misogynist. The 7-year timeline was politically finagled into the preamble of the amendment, knowing that a constitutional question was being created. That question, along with a state's rights to rescind an amendment's ratification, is to come before the courts with the burden of proof on the plaintiffs suing to derail equality. With the burden of proof on the plaintiffs suing to derail equality. I know that my father did not carry a gun in World War II under General Patton in order for this president to thwart our Constitution by blocking publication and arguing in the D.C. Court of Appeals against a democracy that includes women as equally important citizens. You men, instead of kicking democracy in the gut, need to do everything in your power to stabilize its foundations and make sure that the government honors and respects all American citizens, especially its women and girls.
Do you have them?
I don't know.
What?
I don't know.
Do I have them? I have them.
Of course, we all have them.
It's ridiculous.
Yes, it's the United States and they don't have them.
You insisted they should be in our new constitution.
You tell me I should have them, but you don't have them?
What are they again?
Equal rights?
You mean like
Equal rights under the law?
I don't have equal rights.
In America?
Wait, I don't have them?
Equal pay? Well, I want them. Want them? I need them. Wait a minute. Wait. How do we get them?
Demand full equality for women.
Equal means equal.
It's just that simple.
To learn more, go to eraeducationproject.com.
Okay, I think we lost one of Katrina's cameras here. We'll bring her back up in a minute. So we've got another equal means equal video with you, Wendy.
There's a lot of questions around the ERA. There has been a century of propaganda against it. So one of the things we always hear is about this deadline. Could you kind of break that down for us?
Yeah, I mean, the ERA does have a deadline. The question is it constitutional? Is it valid? Or is it void because it's unconstitutional? The reason we've always believed that the deadline is invalid is because under Article 5, which describes how the amendatory process works, it's very clear that the power to amend the Constitution should be equally divided between the national government, the federal government, and the states. Well, in order to make sure that balance stays 50-50, you can't give Congress the power to put deadlines on how long the states need to ratify or to make a decision. Once Congress started putting deadlines in, it basically took away the states' rights to make a decision of any real value, because if they impose a short deadline, the states don't really have a lot of time to ratify. And if they impose a long deadline on something Congress likes, then of course it could be ratified 200 years later, which is exactly what happened with the 27th Amendment. It had no deadline at all. The Constitution should not be subject to frivolity in deciding when it gets amended and how. It should be consistent, it should be the same, and yet we now have a constitutional system that amended the Constitution and adopted the 27th Amendment in 1992, which was 203 years after it was passed by Congress, and yet we've got people saying the ERA isn't valid because it didn't ratify within 7 years. You can't have a constitution that gives 200 years to one amendment and only 7 to another. But right now, that's what we have.
What was the amendment that took 200 years? What was that even about?
It had to do with the timing of congressional pay raises.
So you're telling me they got 200 years to give themselves pay raises, and they wanted to give us 7 years for equal rights. Am I reading that right?
That's about right. Can you have that kind of disparity among the amendments so that some get a lot of time and some don't? Which I think the answer is no. Constitutionally speaking, that's just offensive to the nature.
Does it say anything about you can make timelines in Article 5?
No. Article 5, which tells us how the Constitution gets amended, says nothing about deadlines. It says Congress shall propose an amendment and the states shall ratify. That's it. Nothing about deadlines. There was a case in 1921 that the Supreme Court sort of talked about whether Congress can set deadlines, but it wasn't. It was called dicta. In other words, it wasn't a holding in the case. So there's really no place in the law that says Congress can set deadlines. And that was one of our points when we filed a lawsuit on behalf of Equal Means Equal. We said that the deadline didn't expire because there's no deadline, because the deadline is invalid. And here are multiple reasons why it's invalid. Among other things, and I think one of our most important arguments was, if Congress gets to set the deadline on how long it takes the states to ratify an amendment, then the states really don't have any power at all. They certainly don't have equal power with Congress, and they're supposed to. Under Article 5, their powers are supposed to be equal. But if you say Congress can set a deadline, then basically you've given all the power to Congress, because they can set a long deadline on something they like and a short deadline on something they don't. That's not constitutional.
Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, it's 4 6 Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds like we've got a little bit of a spotty connection here for Katrina. Let's see if we can get our audio clear here.
Yeah, because I don't know if I'm streaming or what I'm doing, honestly. So all I can see is me. Turn the camera on. I don't know what I'm pointed at. I can't see that. I don't even know if I'm.
Yeah, you're good. Yeah, you just have to. Yeah, it's okay. She's gonna use the best footage that she has, but it's just like it's good to have at least. So
right, multiple. Yeah. Okay.
So I'm gonna.
Okay, Katrina, maybe we should start. Wendy, would you like to jump in? And since we don't seem to have anyone narrating right now. Okay. Let's see. Let's unmute you. There we go. Oh. You have to unmute yourself, Wendy.
Okay. All right.
Great.
Sorry. I don't use StreamYard that often, so I didn't know where the unmute button was. Thank you for helping me with that. I am so excited to be here on what I have not very lovingly called Unhappy Constitution Day. It is a holiday that I talk about with a bit of disdain, because I don't think civilized democracy should celebrate a constitution that still practices slavery. Now, let me explain. We've seen a couple of nice videos that go into the basics around this question, which is why don't women yet have basic legal equality under the Constitution? What I'd like to do is really help people understand why, when you don't have basic legal equality, it is a form of slavery. And yet the United States has always held itself out, especially since the Reconstruction Amendments in the late 1800s and the 14th Amendment and 13th and 15th in particular. The United States has held itself out on the world stage as a country that condemns slavery. what the rest of the world doesn't know, and frankly, what a lot of women in this country don't know, is that the only people who were liberated from slavery in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were Black men. And that's because women of all shapes, types, and so forth were excluded. Now, they weren't technically excluded from the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, but the 13th Amendment, like all laws, is modified by the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment affects all laws because it has a provision that states.
National Register of Vote Day.
Do you want me to stop for a second?
I'm not sure. I guess Kat's ready to introduce what's going on here. So,
all right.
Bye-bye.
Kat, you have to unmute. Kat, I don't know if anyone can hear me there. We can't hear her. She's muted.
It's kind of the foundation of, what we understand. And the Constitution makes out
Well,
it looks like she's muted on one and not the other.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, the guy on Katrina's other camera. Can you have her unmute the red Clover? I guess that's Natalia's phone. Have her unmute there.
right to vote. They were asking for the simple right to have a voice in the political system. And some people read the Constitution and they're like, "Oh, it doesn't include men and women." But when we see the fight that would have had to just to gain the right to vote, I mean, they were being thrown in prison and physically being. We obviously know that the Constitution wasn't necessarily and this isn't about giving a special treatment. We just want, the same rights and the same things. And so during that time, they were fighting for right to vote. Finding the right to vote, they should protection in the Constitution are guaranteed to every single U.S. citizen, regardless of their sex. And it seems pretty simple, right? Unfortunately, the sex discrimination actually still legal in the U.S. Constitution. So, to this day, the law is not legally.
Okay, I'm going to make a call here until we can hear better. I think, Wendy, it might be good if you or Jean want to. We just really can't hear what Kat's saying at all.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm just going to mute the other one and let you talk, and hopefully someone will realize they need to unmute the red Clover mic. So go ahead, Wendy.
Okay. So what I was saying before was the importance of understanding that this isn't a simple idea of equality per se. It's about understanding that without equality, women are in fact enslaved. And I do not use that term lightly, but I do use it deliberately. The reason enslavement is a correct characterization of women's status under the United States Constitution is because of what our Constitution says about slavery and what it separately says about the enforceability of laws against slavery when applied to women. Most people understand that the 13th Amendment, after the Civil War, the 13th Amendment was adopted to abolish slavery, and it did. And it says nothing about abolishing slavery only for Black men or only for any category. It just says there shall be no slavery, period. So it has broad application. The problem is, a couple of years later, the 14th Amendment was adopted. And the 14th Amendment added a provision guaranteeing all persons equal protection of the laws. The laws means all laws, from getting a driver's license to freedom of speech, and yes, even laws against slavery, such as the 13th Amendment. Well, equal protection of all laws, although it was applied to persons in the language of the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court then ruled repeatedly that women were not persons. What that means is that as soon as the 14th Amendment became law in 1868, every law in our country, from the Constitution down to the most minor of municipal rules, became subject to unequal enforcement when applied to women. So you can see what I'm saying in terms of why women are enslaved in second-class citizenship, is that if you are not covered by that guarantee of equal protection of the laws, then all laws may be applied unequally to you. Since 1868, our legal system in this country, state and federal, has permitted unequal enforcement of all laws when applied to women. That doesn't just mean in the courts, but it certainly covers the courts. It also means all government action and inaction. Every action by a state official, a local municipal official, a local dog catcher, the police, prosecutors, state and federal government officials have permission from our Constitution to treat women differently and worse at all times, 24/7, including when they choose to enforce a law or not. This is why we have such high rates of abuse of women, whether it's rape, domestic violence, or femicide. This country has a reputation for being among the most dangerous on earth for women. We're in the top 10 most dangerous countries on earth for women, tied for third with Syria for the most sexually dangerous countries on earth for women. And that is the direct result of the fact that our Constitution permits unequal enforcement of laws against the very violence women suffer: rape, domestic abuse, and femicide. If your foundational legal document, whatever country it is, if your foundational legal document does not protect women as equal citizens under the laws, then women will disproportionately be raped, beaten, and killed. And that is the story of the United States of America. That's where women are today, and it's where we've always been since the 14th Amendment was adopted and intentionally excluded women from equal protection of the laws. So what did we do about that? We did what anybody would do if they saw their country adopt a constitution denying women equal protection of the laws. We filed the Equal Rights Amendment. That was proposed to Congress in 1923, the first time. It didn't go anywhere for a long time. It was rewritten in a substantially different way than the original version. The first version said men and women shall have equal rights, and it should have stayed that way. It was rewritten in 1943 to state what it says today, which is equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. It's important and it's a good law. We need it. But because it uses the word sex rather than women, we ended up with a watered down expression of the problem. By saying sex rather than women, people stopped paying attention to the fact that it was only women who were excluded to begin with. The word sex, because it captures males as well as females, created a problem of education, attention, and frankly, engagement. Women were
Wendy, I don't want to interrupt, but I think they're trying to show the installment here now on the building. I'm going to see if we can hear anything. We'll try again. Okay, they still got that mic muted. We'll try the other one. No. Okay, well, keep going.
Okay. You just give me the, give me the notice when I need to stop talking. I'll be happy to do that.
No, you're great. I just don't want to miss anything if we can get them, but it sounds like there's just too much wind and they don't have the phone up close enough. So
well, the good news is the installation is quite visible and visual.
Yes, it looks great.
Yeah, so we'll be able to see it. When we proposed the Equal Rights Amendment, and it didn't go far in Congress, women needed to find a new strategy for how they could rally women to understand that this proposal was important. And they really didn't make a lot of headway in that regard until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. That was when women started to come together, as did a lot of other groups who were fighting for civil rights. Women were fighting for civil rights too, for their civil rights, and frankly, for the rights of others. And that is when they finally mustered enough political strength to persuade Congress to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. And I want to emphasize one thing here, and I hope it's the most salient thing I say. The only reason we even made it to the point where people were paying attention in Washington in the 60s and early 70s was because the movement was led by a woman named Alice Paul. Alice Paul, in the early 1900s, formed and founded the National Woman's Party as a fiercely nonpartisan political activist organization whose sole purpose was to get women the right to vote and to get women equal protection of the laws. She didn't care about anything else. She knew it was important to be very focused because these were the most important rights that women needed. Obviously, getting the right to vote, which she fought for first through the National Women's Party, would give the party and give women more leverage to then fight for equality. The vote was essential in that regard, that we fight for that first. Once we got the right to vote in 1920, we turned immediately to fixing the 14th Amendment and establishing women's equality. And Alice was the leader behind that movement. She was still the leader in the 60s and early 70s when we finally got Congress's attention. And it was because she kept fast to the idea that the National Woman's Party was nonpartisan that she was able to successfully persuade Congress to do the right thing. Why does it matter that she was fiercely nonpartisan and that her organization was militantly nonpartisan? It was because if she supported the idea that women should vote blue or red, they easily would become co-opted and support a candidate regardless of the fact that they had no plans to do the right thing on the ERA. Alice Paul's genius in that regard was essential to the success of the Equal Rights Amendment. And if you read the congressional record, they acknowledge her as the reason they were doing the right thing in 1972 when they finally did pass the Equal Rights Amendment and sent it to the states for ratification. Not surprisingly, because Alice Paul was so powerful as a women's rights leader, and that power came solely from her willingness to be nonpartisan, which is to say she was going to hold both sides accountable. She didn't care what else they would do for women. When she spoke to Republicans and they said, oh, make sure that women vote for me because I'm going to support women's fill in the blank, whatever the issue was. Alice would say, no, we won't vote for you. We don't care about anything else except equality. And unless you do the right thing on equality, we will vote against you. And she would say the exact same thing to a Democrat. The Democrat would say, oh, support us. We support abortion. Support us. We support equal pay. And she'd say, no, you don't tell me what you're going to do for women. We will tell you what we want, and you will do it, or you will be voted out of office. This was her brilliance. She was also quite brave to do that because, as you can imagine, the two-party system is very powerful, and it successfully creates invisibility around important issues like women's equality by creating the fiction that somehow there's a debate between the parties on how they feel about certain issues. This is a really important example of how the two-party system creates invisibility around the fight for equality, because as we now know, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans actually support the Equal Rights Amendment. We know this because, as you heard from Jean earlier, in 2020, when we finally got all the states that we needed to ratify, Trump was in office and he blocked the ERA. He blocked it from being added to the Constitution as our 28th Amendment. Well, lots of women then voted for Kamala Harris and Joe Biden because they said they supported the ERA. But when they got into office in early 2021, they blocked the ERA the same way Trump did. Now, I had filed a lawsuit in federal court in Massachusetts in January of 2020 to try to force the ERA into the Constitution. I sued the federal government for blocking it and said, you can't block it. It is a valid amendment. Put it in the Constitution. And the Trump administration's Department of Justice fought against me. Well, when Biden and Harris got into office in 2021, many of us thought they won't continue to fight against anybody's lawsuit that's designed to establish women's equality, but they did. They fought against my lawsuit, making exactly the same arguments Trump had made. And it wasn't just my lawsuit. Another one was filed after mine, soon after mine, which asserted the same legal arguments that the deadline is not valid, therefore the ERA is valid. The last 3 states to ratify filed that lawsuit in federal court in DC, and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris fought against that lawsuit too. They fought against both of us and made exactly the same arguments that Trump had made. So both cases were unsuccessful, and they were unsuccessful from a women's rights perspective because neither party supports women's equality. There was a time when women thought the Democrats did support women's equality. This situation with the lawsuits to validate the Equal Rights Amendment proved to us beyond any doubt whatsoever that the Democrats, we already kind of knew the Republicans didn't support women's equality. These lawsuits proved beyond any doubt that the Democrats also do not support women's equality. They lie about it, which one could argue is worse than the Republicans. They at least tell the truth that they don't want women to be equal. They do want to control women's lives and bodies. The Democrats lie about it. They say they do support women. They think we should vote blue and in November vote for Harris because they support abortion. Well, I've got news for you. If Biden and Harris had not blocked the ERA when they first took office in 2021, the Supreme Court of the United States could not have overturned Roe versus Wade in the Dobbs decision. Because why? Because the Equal Rights Amendment gives women a textual basis for arguing that they are, in fact, entitled to equal protection of the laws, including abortion laws. In other words, the ERA protects abortion rights. Without it, we don't have a strong argument because the Constitution has excluded us as fully equal citizens. Had Biden and Harris not blocked the ERA in 2021, the same way Trump had done in 2020, the Supreme Court could never have overturned Roe versus Wade, and women would not be in this nightmare fight we're in right now, state by state fight for abortion rights. So let's remember this, and let's stop with the color-coded voting, because Alice Paul knew 100 years ago, voting based on party gets women nothing. Both parties benefit financially from women's enslavement and second-class citizenship. Why? Because enormous amounts of money are made from women's inability to demand equal treatment under all laws. This is always a money issue. It's always been a money issue, and it's going to continue to be a money issue. But once every 4 years, women have enough power to overcome that money. We don't ever accumulate enough wealth to fight back against the moneyed interests that don't want women to have equal rights. We'll never have that amount of money, ever. It's not going to happen. What we do have every 4 years is our vote. We are 170 million women strong. We have the power to unite as women for women and demand this one issue, demand equality under all laws. If we don't get what we want, basic legal equality, if we don't get what we want, put the ERA in the Constitution, we vote against you. It's that simple. We only have the power of our vote once every 4 years. If women tomorrow made an announcement to Kamala Harris, we will not vote for you until Joe Biden puts the ERA in the Constitution, guess what? The ERA will go into the Constitution that day because they need the women's vote. You can call it blackmail. I don't give a shit. I am happy to engage in blackmail around my vote because I don't think of it as blackmail. I think of it as purely democratic activism. If you want my vote, do the right thing. And if you don't, and you lose to Trump, that's on you. That's my message to Kamala Harris.
Absolutely. I agree with you, Wendy. I see you as fierce as Alice Paul, and I'm just glad that Kat introduced me to this issue because, like a lot of women, I had no idea. I just had no idea. But it looks like I don't know what's happened now. I think we've dropped off. I'm going to try to get her to unmute again. I'm afraid the live from Colorado is not going as planned, but that's okay. I have a question for you, Wendy. What would be the best way when I have tried to kind of retell this? I was actually in a TikTok live trying to explain this. It's difficult in like a sentence or two, or I've found it difficult to explain why the ERA solves the abortion issue.
Yeah.
And the best way I can put it, but you probably can put it better than me, and is I say, well, that sort of singles out women as that's pregnancy is something the government can sort of dictate to you as a woman that doesn't apply anywhere else. But I know there's a better way to put that, but I just found myself kind of tongue-tied explaining it because I think that's what really confuses everyone. Because they don't see how it's tied together.
Well, if you don't see that abortion is a women's rights issue, then you've got a problem to begin with. And I don't think I should have to prove to anybody that abortion is a women's rights issue. The ability to control our choices around having a family or not is critical to the most basic notion of what liberty is, right? You cannot be a free human being if the government gets to tell you that you must give birth, or for that matter, that you may not give birth. I mean, remember, the government's ability to control abortion is a two-way street. Right now, we're talking about women wanting to choose abortion, but this same power that we're talking about that the government now has since Roe is overturned could work in the other direction. We could be in a position where the government is requiring us to have abortion. Think of how things were in China a few years ago with the one-child rule. So I think we forget sometimes that what's really at stake here is not just I want to abort a fetus. It's I don't want the government forcing me to have children or controlling my body. Both of these things, not having children or having children is a form of slavery. And that's why I want to keep coming back to that. But let me say how I would explain it, because it is a little complicated. And there are some nuances to the law that you don't have to get dragged down into to make the point, Kelly. And that is that, number one, remember what I said about how the 14th Amendment modifies everything. Everything. If the 14th Amendment denies women equal treatment under all laws, then that covers abortion laws. By definition, the 14th Amendment denying equal treatment to women means women can be treated unequally under abortion laws. The flip side of that is the government can have more power to control women with regard to abortion. That's the flip side of having unequal rights under all laws. That's one point. The second point is this notion that that pregnancy and reproduction, in terms of controlling the body that does the reproducing, is a sex-based issue, because the way our body of law has developed over time to frame the abortion controversy as a sex-based issue has been a little confusing. The Supreme Court, without meaningful debate or discussion ever, and I mean ever, has, in a throwaway sentence in a case, and they repeated it in Dobbs, said abortion is not sex-based, basically because men can't get pregnant. Now, this is a very old-fashioned notion of why something can or can't be sex-based. When you file a lawsuit about being treated differently and worse because you're female, a lot of courts will say, well, compare it to how men are treated. And lawyers get really forced into doing this us versus them dance, right? Well, women are treated this way, men are treated that way. And of course, because men can't, in a comparative sense, be described as suffering from abortion restrictions, they just say, well, since you can't really do that comparison, we're just going to say it's not a sex-based issue, and we're going to take it outside the umbrella of the equal protection doctrine. That is a legal fiction. What I just said is a legal fiction. The cases and the laws are filled with examples of where the courts don't do this type of comparison, that women do suffer discrimination, even in circumstances where the thing that happened to the women is a thing that cannot happen to men. So you don't have to have a men versus women analysis, but that has gets people confused sometimes. Like, why is abortion not considered a women's issue under the law? Because there are some courts that have historically said it's not a women's issue because we can't compare how men are treated because they don't get pregnant. Absolute nonsense. And anyone who knows this issue in a remotely sophisticated legal way understands that that's nonsense. The court has spewed nonsense. But the point is, with the ERA in place, not only do we get the advantage of mandating equal enforcement of all laws, including abortion laws. So that's one good thing, right? That ERA bumps us up to we now must be treated better under all laws, including abortion laws. But there's a second element, which is that the Equal Rights Amendment doesn't really care what the 14th Amendment says. The language is very different. The 14th Amendment talks about equal protection of the laws. The ERA is much broader. In other words, it protects women in a much wider, broader sense than even the 14th Amendment because of how it's worded. So many scholars, myself included, have made the argument that the ERA not only makes clear that abortion is sex-based, it is all-encompassing in the sense that it can ask the question in a court where you're questioning whether you're being treated equally. It's not only interested in, well, how are men versus women being treated? It wants to know this: what is the effect of this change in the law on women's lives? You get to analyze the impact. So even if you think abortion is not a sex-based issue, which is absurd, but even if you think that, or even if you have to deal with that from some crazy courts that have said such things, the ERA gives us this brand new argument because it is a stronger law that we don't have to do that comparison, because under the Equal Rights Amendment, we have to look at the impact. And anyone who thinks the impact of abortion restrictions doesn't disproportionately affect women is a groundhog living in a zoo, because you cannot argue that abortion restrictions don't disproportionately affect women. So the beauty of the ERA is it gives us both of those arguments. Now, to make it super simple, if I were you, all I would say is the fundamental reason the Dobbs court declared that it had the power to overturn Roe versus Wade was, and I'm just going to boil it down, that women are not textually speaking, we are not in the Constitution as a protected class people. We are not a protected class of people in a constitutional sense. Therefore, the Supreme Court can do what it wants to all of our rights, period. That is the gist of what the court said in Dobbs. Well, the ERA, guess what? It puts us in. That's the best way to answer these complicated questions, is to say, look, Alito very much emphasized that the absence of a textual basis for women's equality and or just women generally having rights, the absence of a textual basis for women having status in a constitutional sense just isn't there. Okay, the ERA gets us there, and it changes everything. The minute the ERA is in the Constitution, the minute it gets in there, it affects everything from the First Amendment to the 27th and everything in between. It affects all the municipal laws. It affects all the statutory laws. It affects state and federal governments. And in my view, because I'm an anti-violence activist on behalf of abused women, it makes it illegal for the first time in history for police and prosecutors not to equally arrest abusers, prosecute abusers, and punish abusers. So long as women don't have equal protection of laws against abuse, police, prosecutors, judges, they're all free to discount women's lives, discount their suffering, discount the pain that they go through when they are abused. Why? Because it's acceptable under the Constitution to turn a blind eye to a woman reporting abuse. You can get away with it as a police or prosecutor to say, well, we don't feel like we have enough evidence to win. We don't feel like bringing charges. We just don't think your case is meaningful enough. Right now, prosecutors are allowed to do that. Under the ERA, they can't. It would become illegal. And overnight, women's lives would be saved. Femicide rates would go down. Domestic abuse rates would go down. Sexual assault rates would go down. And in turn, women would be able to live free in this society. How do they live today under our current Constitution? They live in terroristic fear, which is why the name of my recent law review article is subtitled Constitutional Terrorism, a phrase that I coined. It is the way to describe the conditions under which women live their lives. It is terroristic for women to live their lives knowing that all government officials, state and federal, and all laws can treat them differently and worse simply because they're female.
I have a question about, I watched your TED Talk and you talked about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And that was kind of a shocker. Would that be an appropriate topic here or no?
Sure. I love to criticize Ruth Bader Ginsburg primarily because it's so disturbing to me that quote unquote heroes or heroines in the women's movement get propped up and forced upon us, and that we never develop the critical thinking skills to ask the question, are they really on our side? I mean, I went to law school and became a lawyer in an environment where the only thing anyone ever said to me was that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a saint, that everything she did was for women, that her whole purpose in life was to get the ERA and the Constitution and establish women's equality. Well, what people may not know, and what really changed my mind toward her, and now I describe her as evil and duplicitous and really the most dangerous, by far, the most dangerous kind of proponent in the sense that she's smart enough to create the appearance that she's on our side while doing dastardly things to undermine the cause, but doing it in such a sophisticated way that the vast majority of people can't see it. That to me is the most dangerous kind of person. And we all need to learn a little bit more so we can see it when it happens. But what I really became ill over, because I wanted to like her, like everybody else. I've met her a couple times. She certainly sounded sincere. I mean, who am I to criticize, right? That she says she supports the ERA, she must mean it. Well, when our two lawsuits were pending, the one I filed in Massachusetts federal court, and when the states' rights lawsuit was filed in DC federal court, immediately thereafter, Ruth Bader Ginsburg went to an event at a law school in the DC area and answered a planned question from the audience about the ERA. Everyone knew the cases had been filed. It was very highly publicized. So she certainly knew these cases had been filed. And when asked how she felt about the ERA and these new lawsuits, she said to the audience of impressionable young lawyers-to-be, the ERA is dead. Women need to start over. And I nearly had a heart attack when I saw that. It was widely reported that she made those remarks. I nearly fainted because, number one, by saying that out loud, she was essentially declaring that if the Supreme Court ever got the case, she wasn't going to vote in our favor. Number two, it is unethical, in my view, for a Supreme Court justice to state her opinion on an issue that might come before her. And because there were 2 federal court cases pending at the time, it was certainly true that both cases could have landed before her. And in fact, I did get my case before her because I filed a cert petition. She should not have expressed her opinion. I then did research on her background and learned a lot more about how dastardly she was. It's in my law review article, but the short version is, I can see Kat wants to get in. I'll just end by saying what she did in the early 70s when she was claiming to be fighting for women's rights, and she's still today revered for what she did. There's movies and all sorts of stuff saying how great she was. She actually advocated at the Supreme Court level for unequal treatment of women. And even as a Supreme Court justice, she never once supported full equality for women. So there you go.
You're right. I think that's more insidious than just being outwardly against women. Okay, so Kat, if you can hear us, I can't. I've asked her to unmute multiple times. I think there's too much going on there. She can't, I guess, see the notice. I can't unmute her. She's going to have to do it herself. So, Kat, if you can hear me, let me see if there's there's no other camera on right now. I texted her as well, so hopefully she'll figure it out in a few minutes. How do you explain RBG doing that? I mean, what is it?
What I like to say, Kelly, is, and I've learned this the hard way because that was a very painful lesson for me, is never, ever, ever fall in line behind or support the person or the group that gets propped up. There's a very good chance they're being propped up for the purpose of co-opting you, doing the wrong thing, misstating things. I would say this is also true about Planned Parenthood and the Center for Reproductive Rights, both of which have filed lawsuits around abortion rights, but did not assert the Equal Rights Amendment as a basis for their objection. And even when they cited state constitutional equivalents, seeming equivalents of the ERA, because each state can have an ERA and the federal government can have an ERA under their different constitutions. So even when they relied on state constitutional guarantees of equality for women, they didn't ask for the court to enforce the state Equal Rights Amendment equally. I mean, I don't know who does this, but in Texas, a case in which I put myself in because I tried to intervene and I filed a brief and the court allowed me to file my brief. The Center for Reproductive Rights in that case asked the court to strike down an abortion restriction, but do so under second-class legal protections. And I don't get that. Like, what kind of lawyer asks for second-class treatment ever? Why would you ever go to court? Sort of like going to court, before the 13th Amendment and saying, I object to slavery and I hereby would request that the court give all the slaves new socks rather than freedom. Why would you do that? If you're against slavery, you don't go to court and ask the court to enforce slavery. But that is what these reproductive rights groups are doing. And people don't see it because it's complicated. You have to read the brief. You have to have a legal mind. You have to understand concepts like strict scrutiny and intermediate scrutiny to understand why it's so repulsive that a lawyer can go to court and say, I know other people get strict scrutiny, which is the gold standard of legal protections. Well, I'm asking for less than that, only intermediate scrutiny for women. Why would you ever do that? Why?
So how many of these groups are just not understanding?
They understand. They understand.
Well, especially at the top, but I'm thinking like some of these but the people involved down below maybe don't really understand. Obviously, it's probably orchestrated.
Exactly right. Regular people and even most lawyers don't understand. I mean, I'm friends with so many lawyers. I've asked them all the same question. Did you understand this about Ruth Bader Ginsburg? Did you understand this about Planned Parenthood? Some lawyers with whom I've worked on some of these abortion cases over the past couple of years have said to me, and they're just very sincere lawyers who are trying to get maximum legal protections for abortion. They've said to me, I don't understand why Planned Parenthood and the Center for Reproductive Rights are asking courts for second-class treatment. I don't understand.
Okay. Kat, can you hear me? You have to unmute on your end. Oh, there she goes. Okay, well, I'm sure she'll come back. But yeah, it seems to me like a lot of people, they mean well and they're working with these organizations and they just don't understand. But obviously there's
No, and the worst thing is, Kelly, that a lot of very well-meaning women are sending their money to these groups because they think they're helping. They don't understand that it is not helpful to give your money to an organization that goes to court asking for second-class rights. That in my view is legal malpractice. Like those lawyers should be sued for legal malpractice against me. I mean, no lawyer should ever get away with asking the law to treat women as second-class citizens, but it happens every single day in this country. There is no large group of any kind asking for equality under the law for women. And why that's important is, you know, the ERA is one way to get women's equality established in the Constitution. The other way is to ask a judge to order it. Just ask a judge to say, look, I no longer think intermediate scrutiny is appropriate. It's
you want to
embarrassing.
explain that real quick, just since we don't have Kat and we've got 20 minutes, the whole difference between the scrutiny.
Yes. Yeah. I like to teach it. It's a complicated legal concept in many respects, but I like to teach it by showing people this triangle. If I make horizontal lines across the triangle, one at the top and one toward the bottom, you got three pieces. Those reflect what I call the levels of scrutiny. At the top is strict scrutiny, which is a tiny little piece of the triangle. That reflects the relative percentage of discrimination that makes it through. If you get in front of a judge and you say, I'm suffering discrimination, if you get strict scrutiny review by the court, very little makes it through, because when you're strict, when you're assessing whether some discrimination ought to be tolerated, if you're using a strict standard of review, very little makes it through. That's the tiny size of the triangle. At the very bottom is what's called rational basis review. You can see it's a very big piece of the triangle. And again, that reflects the amount of discrimination the law will tolerate if you are a category of person that gets that low level of review. Well, women are in the middle. So we're not at the top, but we're in the middle, and it's a big chunk. And that's where what we call intermediate scrutiny takes place. Because it's a big piece, what we need to understand is that's, relatively speaking, how much discrimination against women is allowed under the Constitution. That's what I mean by second-class citizenship. First-class citizenship is up in that tiny triangle known as strict scrutiny. Second-class citizenship, which is where women are, is down in that very big middle piece. Now, mind you, we're not at the very bottom anymore. We were there. In 1971, the very first time the Supreme Court said that women were finally persons under the 14th Amendment, they said, you're going to be persons, but you're going to be third-class persons, because we're barely going to give you any attention whatsoever under the Equal Protection Clause. We're only going to review discrimination against you under this bottom piece, which means virtually anything a court says about why they're discriminating is going to be allowed. A few years later, we got bumped up to intermediate scrutiny, and that's where we remain today, in that second-class space. Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a chance, RBG as a Supreme Court justice, had a chance to bump us up to that top tier. Now, mind you, the court might not have all agreed with her, but she had a chance to voice her opinion and say, women ought to be up at this top tier, and she didn't. She said women deserve that second-class space, which was really heartbreaking and scandalous. But it was clear now that, she didn't really actually support women's equality. If she wanted to support women's equality, she could have dissented.
And how do you explain that? I mean,
Because she never supported women's equality. My suspicion is she was likely being paid by monies that benefit profit-wise from women's inequality when she started doing her work for the ACLU in the early 70s, which is when she started filing cases, quote unquote, on behalf of women's rights. Now, mind you, anyone who knows the ACLU knows they don't support women's equality, never have, never will. They gave it lip service around the time RBG was doing her cases because they had to appear to be supporting women's equality in order for her to do her work. But they really don't, and they never have. And anyone who knows anything about the ACLU knows they have never supported equal treatment of women, period. Not as a constitutional matter. They might once in a while support equal treatment of women in a specific case, like in an employment case. But generally speaking, as a constitutional matter, they don't. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg was on their board when she started doing all this dangerous work to undermine our fight for the ERA in the early 70s. She then created, again, just for the appearance of it all, some kind of a women's group within the ACLU, and used that to make it look like she actually stood for, equality, and that there was this new group at the ACLU that was going to focus on women's equality. No, it was a propped up bunch of nonsense that gave her some legitimacy, the appearance of legitimacy. Meanwhile, and I've read all of her briefs. That she filed in the early 70s. And never once did she ask for strict scrutiny. Never once. Other people did on behalf of their clients. And certainly, anyone else doing civil rights work would always ask for strict scrutiny, but Ruth Bader Ginsburg never did. Even lower courts would sometimes say it's really important that women have strict scrutiny, but she never asked for it, ever.
I live in a very blue area. I'm right by UNC Chapel Hill in North Carolina, and there's a little restaurant across from this food co-op. And I know all the people around here largely are they believe this stuff. And there was a big poster of RBG up on the window of this restaurant, and I just want to go in there and tell them, but like, I don't know how do you find, where have you found success, like breaking through? Like, are there particular group, like?
Yeah, there are academics, people who really study this stuff, have always known that she's been hostile to women's equality. They don't get a lot of favor. They don't get invited to give lectures and all this because she is a propped up icon, and the propaganda around her is so potent that it almost feels sacrilegious to criticize her. But once I read, I didn't criticize her until after even though I was suspicious, I didn't criticize her until after she made the public statement, the ERA is dead, women need to start over. That was such a punch to the stomach that I started criticizing her. But I also said, let me give her the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to assume she just, for whatever reason, agrees with this idea that the deadline is not valid. Let's assume it's a sincere intellectual, academic feeling. So I said, I'm going to go research on my own. I'm going to go read everything she's ever written and see if I'm right. My hunch was that there was going to be some pretty dark stuff that I found, but I didn't want to find it. I wanted to be disproven. I wanted to read her briefs and go, oh, well, she did fight for strict scrutiny. And there's obviously something else going on now, but she did fight for strict scrutiny. And so I'm not going to criticize her. But what I found was, wow, she not only didn't ask for strict scrutiny, she was pretty sinister in how she strategically injected herself into the most important cases of the day that were then going up to the Supreme Court on questions around women's equality. And those briefs that she wrote could have been written by opponents to women's equality. The difference was she would include 6 pages of rhetoric about how women suffer. This is terrible. Women need equality. Women need equality. But her ultimate request in the brief was, therefore, don't give women equality. Now, she didn't say it as directly as I did. What she did was never ask for strict scrutiny. If the courts are debating whether to apply strict scrutiny for women, and the quote unquote leading women's rights attorney asks for something less than strict scrutiny, the court not only isn't going to give women strict scrutiny, it's going to feel confident that it can get away with not giving women strict scrutiny because that leading women's rights lawyer didn't even ask for it. That's where my gut sense of her really changed dramatically. And I started saying publicly that we need to really take her down. And I don't mean to do it gratuitously. I mean, we need to take her down so that we can rebuild. And we need to rebuild with new heroes, with new leaders, We cannot afford to follow useless groups that distract us and that sap our resources, including groups like Planned Parenthood, Center for Reproductive Rights. If we send our money to them, we're just participating in our own subjugation. If we send money to the National Organization for Women or the Feminist Majority, the National Women's Law Center, these are all anti-feminist groups that have the highest profile, that receive enormous amounts of money, that have actually been hostile to the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, mind you,
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the now, but I do want to, if Jean wants to jump in here, please do.
Yes, Jean, go right ahead.
One thing before I forget it, though, is what you said about her rhetoric.
Yeah.
I find that this is a tactic.
Yes.
You see it everywhere in politics. They just repeat, like, whether it's economic issues or everyone is suffering and they have high health insurance premiums. Okay. And
therefore
they repeat it.
Yes. Yeah.
And it gets people on their side, and it just, I don't know, boggles my mind. But
it's
Jean,
a tried and true tactic.
Jean, please, if you like. I don't know where Kat is, so we're doing our own broadcast here.
I think what's so sad about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, from my perspective, is that we don't have a foundation to build off of today, asking for strict scrutiny for, and I think that is really difficult for us because we don't have the foundation. I mean, if Ruth Bader Ginsburg had asked for strict scrutiny, then at least there's research and a foundation. But without it, we're kind of, as Wendy said, we have to rebuild. And the other thing I wanted to comment on, I just saw a fabulous movie called Show Her the Money. And I had no idea that in the venture capital world, only 2% of venture capital money is going to women-owned businesses. And so it's so fascinating because there is a conversation kind of in the political milieu right now about small businesses and supporting small businesses and all of this. But in this movie, not only did they talk about only 2% of the funding going to women's owned businesses, which is insanity. I mean, 98% is going to businesses owned and operated and started by men. The other thing that they were talking about is that they will get the first tranche of money, but they can't get the second. So they can't really. So it's and the statistic for the nonprofits is 2%. 2% of all of the money that is handed out to for nonprofits only goes to women So they're economically strangling us, and it's very clear what's happening, and and as Wendy has taught me so much in this realm is follow the money. She always says follow the money, but I do think that it's really fascinating to understand what's happening not only in the nonprofit world but then in the venture capital world. Because I think it's really, I call, women who are working in the waged economy are being underpaid. So if you're a white woman working in wage economy, getting 80 cents to the male dollar. If you're a woman of color, you're getting 69. If you're Latina, you're getting 57, however those numbers work. But the unwaged economy, the care economy, the economy where the work that we're doing, we work all the time. We're working all the time. I mean, we're never not working, but when we're in the care economy, the unwaged economy, there's no value given to that. And again, in the political discourse is this whole idea that, if you have a child, your aunt can help you, or your mother can help you, or your sister can help you. Well, but that's asking those women to be in the care economy unwaged as well. And then there is nothing. I mean, all these these gals are coming out here, and if they're not in the waged economy, they're, there's no social security or support for them. So it really, economically, it's really wild.
That's a great point. I remember years ago, there was something that came out, I don't know, maybe 2010 or so, but it was a study they did, they sort of broke down, like if you took a mother that's not in the waged economy, as you said, and you actually had to pay someone to do everything that she did in raising children, a budget, all that, it was, well over six figures.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Wendy knows. How many children do you have, Wendy?
I have 5, and I didn't get paid to birth any of them. Not to mention all the other stuff.
Taking care of them.
I always hear people talk about reparations, which I totally get and appreciate. It's not, it's not a field in which I do a lot of work. But what I do try to say, and I think we need to always do this as women, is if you're going to pay reparations to Black people for slavery, which you should, then you absolutely have to pay reparations for women's free labor, literally birthing our species into existence, continued existence. That is not only valuable, it's the most valuable thing, right? Because otherwise, there are no economies without bodies. And the other thing that we always talk about but never do anything about, of course, is childcare and housework. Although there are plenty of economics papers that have put a value on it if we did get paid. I'm not afraid of hitching my wagon to anti-racism stories because I think they are the same stories. And women have been propagandized not to do that because, Black people suffered more, or this is the argument, Black people suffered more, or slavery was worse. I no longer get involved in debates about what's worse and all these hierarchies about whose suffering was worse and all of that. Because what I've realized is that the attempt to separate Black people and women was deliberate, it was political, it was strategic, and it has been successful. So now what I tend to say is anytime anybody makes an argument about what can be done to improve the status of Black people who at least have strict scrutiny, they at least have that strong argument that they can make if they suffer harm based on race. What I tend to say is, yes, and let me tell you about Black women. Because the liberation of Black people in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments did nothing, and I mean nothing, for Black women. I know it means that they were no longer slaves in a traditional sense, but they basically became enslaved by their husbands or their fathers. I mean, and there were lots of Black women who said, we are now kind of in the same shit as white women because yes, we've been liberated, but now we're all in this murky hell together where we're not even allowed to speak up. And today, a lot of Black women will say, I feel terrible if I call the police after my husband beats the hell out of me, because there's a lot of anti-racism rhetoric out there saying, let's not put any more Black men in prison. And Black women will say, I need him to go to prison or I'm going to end up dead. Or, I want to call the police because why should I have to be beaten to accommodate concerns about, Black men disproportionately being in prison? That's not the fault of Black women at all. And so what I try to do is, number one, always find a way to turn a women's rights argument around into the same argument we all embrace comfortably when it's made about race, but also try to say very honestly to Black women, because we shouldn't be silent about this. No one should be silent out of fear you're going to offend Ruth Bader Ginsburg fans, fear you're going to be criticized by a Black woman for purporting to understand her life. I never purport to understand a Black woman's life. What I say is, you're allowed to prioritize your sex-based suffering. You're not required to subjugate your sex-based suffering and prioritize your race-based suffering. For many Black women, their sex-based suffering is worse, but no one lets them complain like that. So I really think we are, among other things, being pigeonholed, being divided, and frankly, being culturally silenced around the importance of saying to each other, we are women. We might not all be the same sexual orientation. We might not be the same gender identity. We might not be the same race, religion, ethnicity. We may not have anything in common in a socioeconomic sense, but we are the same when it comes to our subjugation as women. And if we can't see the value of coming together across all of those lines and using our 170 million strong votes as power, if we don't see that we have enormous power in our unity, then we deserve what we get. That's what I'm saying. We need a leader who can speak this to us. I wish that I could name someone who I think could do it. I think it's probably going to be a young person who understands the duopoly is harmful to lots of things, but including especially to women's fight for equality. It's not complicated to say to women, let's come together and not pay any attention to people who want to divide us by saying, well, you don't have the same experience as her. You know, you're Jewish. You need to focus on being Jewish. You need to focus on being Hispanic. Bullshit. We are going to focus on being female. We are going to come together as females to fight against our common oppression, which is our femaleness. Once we do that, once we invoke Alice Paul's genius and do that, come together in unity as women to fight for women about women suffering, we will prevail.
We had a couple of comments. I guess we should wrap up. I guess Kat decided to focus on the local, what was going on there. We just didn't, unfortunately, have a good mic. But anyway, I think we had a good discussion. Thank you so much, Wendy. But there were some comments here from, and also, I'm sorry, Peggy, right? Jean, I'm sorry. There's someone else I think that was going to join named Peggy. Okay, Jean, apologies. Okay, so we've got a couple of comments here from Equal Means Equal. And yeah, talking about National Organization of Women. Let's see, did not realize their leadership has no intention of seeing the ERA enshrined in the Constitution. So that maybe we should wrap up. But that we maybe I'll make a clip from that, because I know you spoke about the National Organization of Women and how that interfered back. I don't know what year that was, in the 40s, but I think maybe it is in another clip I made of you.
And these sorts of organizations, generally speaking, these large establishment organizations are not only deeply anti-women's equality, they tend to be proxy groups for the Democratic Party. So their primary interest is in electing Democrats because that's where the money is. That's where the money comes from for them. And they get funding from other anti-equality sources, some of them corrupt. I would point to the porn and sex trafficking industries as big funders of some of these large so-called women's groups. Porn and sex trafficking as an industry benefits tremendously from women's inequality. If women actually had equality, we'd be able to expect equal enforcement of laws against sex trafficking, because we are not equal under the law. We cannot expect equal treatment under sex trafficking laws. Therefore, women are disproportionately sex trafficked. It's really that simple. Well, industries that make a lot of money from women's inequality are going to spread that money around in a way that keeps women away from each other, that stops women from uniting, that stops women from even understanding that the ERA isn't yet the law. I mean, we do not teach this stuff at any level of education, K to 12, even college and even law school. We really don't teach people in this country that women don't yet have equality, which is why about 90% of people don't get it. They don't understand. What do you mean? Why? Of course women are equal. No, they're not. But how would you know that if you weren't educated? And if your public school system is structurally designed to make sure you don't learn that, and that in fact you instead in your schooling years are taught about women winning the right to vote and all of that stuff, instead of this problem around equality, then it's hard to rally. It's hard to get excited. It's hard to be motivated to fight for change because you are ignorant. It's not through your own fault, but you are ignorant. You will not fight for rights that you don't know you don't have.
Right. Well, why don't we, this last comment here, and I'm sorry, Jean, when I had the other comment up, it was covering your name, so I couldn't see it. But I thought we could cover this last comment here. Lenora Lapidus was head of, do you know this story?
I do.
So it sounds like she was head of the ACLU's Women Project, did support the ERA, but they fought her tooth and nail.
Yeah, no, that's a very common story. Ellie Smeal, the same thing, head of the feminist majority. She was once the head of Now. She's so hostile to the ERA, it's embarrassing. Yet she'll raise money off of it. And she often sends fundraising letters out after something happens with the ERA. She does not deserve anyone's allegiance or support, period. None of those groups do.
Do they ever address you directly, or do they ever respond directly of why?
Yeah,
do they
sometimes.
ever give any reason?
Yeah.
Do they give any marginally reasonable explanation for why they don't?
Well, what I can tell you about,
against?
I'll tell you a couple things. One is Ellie Smeal and I were on a panel at the Belmont Paul House, which was in DC, which was at one time the headquarters of the National Women's Party. It's where Alice Paul wrote the ERA. It's a really important space. And I was there to give a talk about what we were planning to do with the ERA once the last state ratified. So I was there a long time before the last state ratified, so before 2020. Ellie was invited also, and I gave my presentation and said, here's why the deadline is not valid. Here's what I'm going to do when we get involved in litigation, et cetera, and so forth. She got up and said, I agree with Wendy. And then she said, and I, on behalf of the feminist majority, have law firms lined up around the country, constitutional law firms, civil rights law firms, and they are going to file cases in court as soon as the last state ratifies, and I can't wait. We're going to go to court and fight like hell, just like Wendy said. I totally agree with Wendy. And I was like, who is this person? Because I knew she didn't support the ERA, but I accept her at her word. She said this in front of 100+ people. So I nodded, and then I had to leave. So I didn't get to put her on the spot. I had to catch a plane. I had an argument in the First Circuit the next morning, so I couldn't stay. People did stay, and she used the time to schmooze and tell people that this was her plan. She had all these court cases planned. Well, then Virginia became the last state to ratify. A year and a half later or so, Virginia became the last state to ratify, and I did exactly what I said I would do. I filed a lawsuit in federal court in Massachusetts, and Ellie did nothing. Nothing. No lawsuits, no constitutional law firms filing things. We even asked her to at least support our case with an amicus brief. She wouldn't. I mean, it's just...
Is there a way
stunning.
to then reach all the people that were there at this event? I mean, it seems to me like some public, I'm sorry to put it this way, but public shaming is maybe like what is required, So the truth can get out.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to the question how to get it to all those people, but I've certainly written about it in my new law review article. I exactly say what I just said to you. She did nothing.
Wow. Well, Kat, I'm so sorry. We tried. I guess you couldn't see. I kept asking. I couldn't unmute one of your cameras because the one that would have probably had a better audio, because you had to unmute it on your end. But we got we saw the building.
I mean, we had some Wi-Fi issues and like tech issues, and then plus, there are people there who want to know. I was like, well, I'm just hoping everything. But as soon as I literally just walked in the door, and I saw like your text, and I saw like emails from Kamala Lopez, like, we can't hear you. It's just like, yeah,
it happens. We don't have the budget of CNN to do these like big broadcasts, but we do our best.
audio?
Okay, wait, you're a little spotty right now too. Say that again.
Were you able to catch any audio at all?
Not really.
We couldn't hear you.
Mm-mm.
Oh,
So there were two cameras, and I guess it was Natalia's. Probably would have been able to hear you a little better, but it was muted, and I couldn't unmute you on my end. You had to. It's okay. You were focusing on being there. I've been there in those kinds of situations. You're trying to be present, and live stream. It's really difficult. So
yeah, well, our musician was really awesome. Like it's too bad you couldn't hear because I had listened to her music, but I hadn't listened in depth. But the words, the lyrics were really, really good. It was
well,
like
maybe we can. Why don't we we can post it somewhere?
Yeah, you recorded it, right?
Well, does she have another recording? Maybe we can.
Someone did record it. It's not live stream, but he said he would send me the recording, so that will be later. So
yeah, we can try to clean up the sound and we'll put it somewhere. But I think I'll end the stream now.
Yes, yeah.
But okay.
All right. Well, I 1 second before you do.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to, since no one heard what I was saying, over at the event, I'll just reiterate it. And I'm sure both of, all of you have said it. It's Constitution Day. Oh, you weren't able to put the.
Oh, I didn't put. You know what? I'm sorry. I got so distracted with the tech issues, but why don't I put that up now?
Okay, yeah, put it up now. So there is a texting number and a calling number where you can call the White House and you can tell them to publish the ERA. And, this would be the perfect day to do it due to it being Constitution Day. And, I already said it so many times at the live event, but it's ready to go, and I'm sure Wendy and Jean have both been saying this, during the event, but Kelly's going to get up the phone number for everyone.
Yeah.
Did you find it?
Well, yeah, I have it right here. Okay. But we'll just, when we repost this or something, we can add this as well, maybe with the song and everything else. Okay. Okay.
Well, thank you, Jean and Wendy. Sorry we had some tech issues. We did our best, but it was a good turnout. I thought, it's right across from the bus depot. I don't know if you were able to see the art, but it turned out really good. So
no, but could you send us a picture? That would be great.
Yeah, I'll post it on my Twitter and then I'll email you all.
Sorry, I should have had this up.
Yes, it's okay. So
when you publish it?
Yeah, we could. That's true. We could. I could do like I did on the other one, Kat, and clean it up, and we'll repost or something.
Whatever. So everyone who's watching right now, check out this phone number. Call the White House, text the White House, whatever. Text them every day, call them every day. Get involved.
Can I add a little thing to that, Kat? When you text or call the White House, don't say please publish. Don't say make the call. Don't say damn it publish. Say I will not vote for Kamala Harris unless you publish. Let's use our muscle. This fucking way women are so polite makes me sick. We need to make this into a straight up blackmail campaign. Do the right thing, or we will not vote for Kamala Harris. Period.
Okay, I'm making a clip of this with this scrolling, and we'll post that. There we go. Okay. Maybe I'll
Yeah, our next live stream, our scrolling thing will be do not vote until we'll do a blackmail movie, okay?
Yes. The time for blackmail has arrived.
All right. All right. Well, thank you all for